NASA experts have estimated there's between 100 million and 1 billion tons of water at each pole, at the North Pole and at the South Pole of the moon. Water is oxygen and hydrogen. With energy, you can make those propellants, and the way you make those propellants, they burn in a rocket engine fuel rich, which means there's excess oxygen from that process for breathing oxygen for humans. It's perfect. Like water on the moon is like finding oil, in the Middle East, or gold in California. It makes moon the most valuable real estate in the solar system after Earth. China's headed there. We should be headed there also.
Hi, everyone. This panel is going to be a little different. We're going to be focused on talking about our generation's space race rather than AI. Both the United States and our near-peer adversaries like China have plans to put humans in permanent bases on the surface of the moon over the next decade. There is serious risk that a decade from today, the primary language on the moon will be Chinese, and the lunar government will be run by a genocidal dictatorship rather than a democratic republic. Let's talk about how we prevent that. My panelists on stage today are Chairman Ken Calvert, who represents California's 41st Congressional District, and he serves on the House Appropriations Committee as the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. And in some ways most interesting, he also has a rivet that he installed on a Varda reentry capsule that went into space and back in his office. My other panelist, Tom Mueller, is one of the world's leading spacecraft propulsion experts. As one of SpaceX's founding members, he was responsible for much of their propulsion technologies and is now the founder and CEO of Impulse Space, where he's helping lead the development of the in-space transportation infrastructure that will help accelerate the expansion of the overall space economy. So to kick things off, Chairman Calvert, Mueller, who do you guys think are the main players in this upcoming sort of new space race, and why is space such a critically important and contested domain?
If you want me to start out, obviously China is moving very quickly in space. We're still the leaders, but China's nipping at our heels, and Russia still has significant capability. So, but we have a lot of other players. India is certainly getting involved. Other countries are building up their space capability. But to get to Moon and to Mars, I think the United States and China are the two primary folks that get there.
And we're all here today because there's obviously a new frontier of commercial integration into the processes and the platforms of the DoD. But how do you guys think that companies can best step in? Where are the opportunities you see for explosive growth in the space sector? And what do you think companies should be doing that they aren't yet today? Tom, maybe you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing explosive growth in space, and that mainly started with SpaceX. It's like they went from, who are you guys, to, launching every couple days, have 6,000 satellites on orbit, have brought internet into space, and using Starlink to fund basically further growth, which is the Starship, a fully reusable vehicle, which will bring down the cost of access to space by another order of magnitude and increase the tonnage that can go to space with each flight by almost order of magnitude. And that's, I think, that's going to really start what I call the true space age. I think where it's going to be economically viable to do real work in space, manufacturing like your company does. They're going to establish propellant depots, so basically gas stations in space, if you want to think of it that way, so the hardware like Impulse Space's space transportation vehicles can stay up there and be reused and refuel with propellant that's in space, which allows you to then work and build in space. And I think AI and robotics are really going to play heavily. It's very expensive to keep and dangerous to keep people in space. I think there will be some people in space, but I think that we're going to have over the next 10 years, we're going to have AI and very advanced robotics that are being developed very, very rapidly now that can really help assemble in space. And I think once you start that explosive growth in space, where you have a real true commercial economy happening in space, I think it won't take too long until you realize that it's about 23 times more energy efficient to bring matter from the surface of the moon into the low Earth orbit than it is from the surface of Earth and the low Earth orbit, because the gravity well on Earth is so much greater. And so it's really going to be an economic advantage to just get water from the moon, minerals, metals from the moon, to really continue that explosive growth in space. And then that's why I think that starts the true space age. And we're using the resources in space, so we're offloading resource depletion on Earth, and allows us to really expand out into the infinite frontier of space.
Tom brought up several technologies that later stage companies like SpaceX are building, Starlink as well as Starship, and R2 companies, Varda focused on in-space manufacturing, Impulse on in-space propulsion. These are clearly sort of net new capabilities that the United States has, but are only possible because of faster moving, disruptive, venture-backed companies. There's clearly a need for the DoD to foster relationships with these type of companies, and recently the department published the Commercial Space Integration Strategy that is a good step in the right direction. Chairman Calvert, do you think that there are other areas related to space capabilities that you hope to see the department leaning into and encouraging improved integration with these non-traditional defense partners?
Absolutely. Commercial ventures are actually moving a lot quicker than we do in government, so it works to our benefit to collaborate with these commercial actors, and we're doing that by creating opportunities in the department to move quicker. We've created the DIU that's running by Doug Buck is running, AppFit, which Heidi Shue is operating. I see the generals here from Future Army Command. So we're recognizing that the commercial sector is putting a lot more money in R&D than we are in the Department of Defense. We're still a big player, and we're a large investor to work with some of these new companies for our national security. And we obviously, whether it's mapping or whether it's buying imagery, a whole number of things that, and communications obviously, but a whole number of things that we can work with industry on. So looking forward to doing that.
As much as you're willing to sort of share publicly, we discussed a bit in the green room that Russia has plans to put a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit. What are some of your biggest sort of fears when it relates to either sort of China or Russia's space capabilities or their anti-space sort of capabilities? How should we be countering those types of capabilities? And where can commercial entities like Varda, Impulse, and SpaceX actually help support our national security priorities in space?
I remember 25 years ago when I was chairman of Space Aeronautics, we were talking about not militarizing space. Remember those days? That we're going to stop that, any country from doing that. Well, China led the way, and obviously Russia has followed, and now we're obviously going to react to that. And so that horse has left the barn. Obviously, according to news reports, Russia is moving forward to put apparently a 1 megaton bomb into low Earth orbit. And that's basically as blackmail against the world. If something happens that they don't agree to, that they would threaten to have that bomb go off. And of course, everything in low Earth orbit would be destroyed because of the radiation field it would create around the world. So that kind of activity, hopefully Russia will not do that. Hopefully sane people in the world will talk to our whatever sane people are left in Russia and get them to stop that, but we'll see.
And Tom, as somebody who has to sort of operate in the low Earth orbit environment and has been responsible for a lot of in-space sort of propulsion, how would you even imagine operating your company in a sort of sphere where China and Russia are actively conducting military activities?
Well, if a large nuclear weapon was let off in low Earth orbit, not only would the radiation just destroy everything on that side of the Earth immediately, but then the collisions of all the debris would continue, and it would be basically low Earth orbit would be unusable possibly for decades. So if you wanted to shut off space completely, that would be the stupid thing to do. Like the congressman said, hopefully nobody's stupid enough to do that.
And maybe to explain a bit for the audience, why is space such a contested domain, and why is it so strategically important, not just to activities in space, but also for activities down here on the ground? Where does the downside of ceding the high ground to China or Russia actually affect people here in this room?
Well, you called it. It's the high ground. I mean, that in the environment we live in today, with the electronics that we live with, the internet, our GPS systems, our day-to-day lives are dependent on what happens in space. And obviously the military is dependent on targeting, on a whole number of things, what happens in space. So ultimately we need to be sure that we're leading in that. And so we need to invest in that and make sure we continue to be the leaders in space and make sure that we're the sane actor and that we keep people from doing stupid things like Russia is proposing.
And Mr. Chairman, I know you've been a longtime leading proponent in Congress for DoD's need to move faster to field innovative technologies. You referenced DIU earlier. The fiscal year 24 appropriations bill included a nearly tenfold increase in DIU's budget and increases for rapid fielding and prototyping. How do you think those upcoming resources and authorities will help the U.S. maintain this competitive edge in space? Do you have particular areas where you're hoping for the DIU department to support?
Well, DIU is going to be looking at various technologies, not just space, but various technologies, including space. And Doug Beck, who was a senior executive at Apple, understands those types of capabilities very well. He understands why space is important, and he'll make the right. I have confidence he'll make the right kind of investments. We have $1 billion in FY24. I would like to have that go up somewhat in FY25. We also increased the APFIT program, which Heidi is running from $150 million to $300 million. We'd like to see more of that because we're trying to bring in some of the smaller companies that have very good capability, and we can get them through that so-called valley of death. I hate that terminology. It's overused, but nevertheless, get them through it, get them to procurement, get them on contract, and that sends a market signal. And we also created, by the way, the Office of Strategic Capital, which we funded out at $86 million, but we think that could leverage anywhere from $5 to $6 billion in private capital formation. So these are things that I think are working in the right direction.
From my experience at Varda, I definitely feel that the term valley of death was maybe more relevant in the 2015 through 2020 timeframe, but our company started and within 3.5 years was awarded a $60 million, StratFi, the Office of Strategic Capital, DIU's increase. All of these things clearly point towards the department significantly improving how they interface with innovative companies. Tom, I'd be curious, what has been your experience at Impulse in regards to integrating and working with the DoD? Obviously, our adversaries like China take a whole nation approach to exerting their national security priorities. They effectively obviously control ByteDance, and in relation to TikTok, they directly control all of their space capabilities. Meanwhile, in the United States, we often expect the DoD to be the lone agency responsible for countering China's objectives, but need to rely on these commercial space capabilities. Tom, how do you think there could be better collaboration between regulators, DoD, commercial players such as yourselves, and where do you think policymakers like Ken Calvert could help play in bringing more interagency alignment?
Yeah, I think just a little bit of sprinkling money that was happening before wasn't working, and the way that my company had avoided the valley of death, as you mentioned, was we just went after immediate commercial markets to fund, because we know that that trying to get government contracts takes, you get a little bit of seed money, you have to do these things, and it just takes a long time. And there's a lot of talk in the government, in the Space Force about, sustained space operations and dynamic space, moving around in space, but there's no money until now. So now they're starting to show the money, which is great to see. So we want to take some of that money. Investors are paying for us so far. Let's get some investment from the U.S. If you think about the first space race, the original space race right after World War II, the first satellites, went into orbit 10 years later, and then within 15 years, we're walking on the moon. But that was 5% of the GDP of the U.S. to fund that. And now I'm not saying we need 5% of the GDP to do what we need to do, but to stay ahead in space, we need some more investment from the government. Match the funds that we're getting from VC and from investors to help us keep moving forward and stay ahead of our adversaries.
That's a good point, because even at the $1 billion and some of the money we put in these various programs, it's probably about little over 1% of total outlay in the department's budget. We're the largest enterprise in the world, the Department of Defense. We have a budget. We include our nuclear weapons program. It's about $1 trillion. It's a large operation, very cumbersome, very bureaucratic, and very difficult to operate under. We recognize that, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to innovate and bring in these people that can do things better, faster, and cheaper. I love the 5 primes that we have left, but sometimes it's difficult for them to move quickly on things that are necessary.
We talked a bit about why sort of low Earth orbit is a critical high ground and is a contested domain. But as I started off the panel, I would argue that the moon is ultimately, in some ways, the most important civil and military objective over the course of the next decade. Tom, you briefly touched on this, but I would love for you to expand a bit further about what the advantage would be to the first nation state that has established a permanent, sort of lunar presence. What does that mean for materials to low Earth orbit, to Mars, expanding throughout the solar system? Why is the moon so important?
The moon has, NASA experts have estimated there's between 100 million and 1 billion tons of water at each pole, at the North Pole and at the South Pole of the moon. Water is oxygen and hydrogen. It's with energy, you can make those propellants, and the way you make those propellants, they burn in a rocket engine fuel rich, which means there's excess oxygen from that process for breathing oxygen for humans. It's perfect. Like water on the moon is like finding oil, in the Middle East or gold in California. It makes moon the most valuable real estate in the solar system after Earth. China's headed there. We should be headed there also. And like I talked about, this explosive growth of the economy, the moon has a much lower gravity well. It doesn't take rocket propulsion to get off the moon. You can use a mass driver, like a catapult or a mass driver to get things off the moon into low Earth orbit. So you don't even have to burn that propellant. You can get water easily from the moon in tanks or even in blocks of ice into low Earth orbit, assemble gigantic solar arrays in orbit to get power to make propellant, and you have gas stations in space. So it's critically important to use. And also I would mention the near Earth asteroids same thing. They're full of water and minerals, metals, everything. Everything that's on the Earth is in these objects in the inner solar system. So you can build and operate in space without depleting and polluting the Earth. So I think that's where we're headed. It kind of seems far-fetched now, but reusable rockets seemed far-fetched 20 years ago. Internet in space seemed far-fetched 10 years ago. It's needed, and I think it's going to happen.
And given that sort of the moon is such an important high ground, and to date the United States' only real approach has been Artemis, which is funded obviously by our civil space agency. NASA today is at its lowest budget on our percentage of the entire government's budget basis over the course of the last 50 years. Chairman Calvert, how do you think about at what point should the department start to be prioritizing sort of lunar activity, lunar capabilities, not just from our civil programs, but also from our military programs?
Well, as you know, NASA has a plan to get back on the moon. The plan states somewhat between FY25 and 26. I suspect that might slip a little bit. But at some point, we've created, as you know, a Space Force, and that Space Force will be actively involved in going to the moon at some point. And that discussion is ongoing. Obviously, China is probably going to militarize the moon. I have no doubt. And so I suspect we will have a base on the moon also. And that's not out of the... And maybe by the end of this decade.
And in the summer of 2021, China demonstrated the first ever boost glide hypersonic missile system that ultimately came down from low Earth orbit, circled the Earth, and got close to its target. It's clear that it's an area that the United States is behind China, and we're rapidly looking to modernize systems to advance hypersonic testing capabilities. We can see that China is fielding these technologies, even though we have not yet, and we're not just there. Where do you see, Chairman Calvert, some of the current gaps in S&T and the fastest way to increase our hypersonic capabilities to match the Chinese, given that we expect them to militarize the moon one day? In some ways, they've already militarized low Earth orbit, and we have not yet fielded those same capabilities.
Ironically, we developed the hypersonic missile. The ramjet engine was developed in 1996. Mike Griffin then was head of NASA. We did the test. It was a successful test. I think we got up to Mach 9 at that time before it burned out, but we offered the technology to the U.S. Air Force. They declined. The Chinese promptly stole the technology and perfected it, and now have deployed it and have over 1,000 maneuverable hypersonic missiles. We have none, zero. We have invested significant amount of money into developing a hypersonic missile. That contract, we have a Navy contract, an Army contract. Air Force, the Aero program had been canceled. There's still another contract with Raytheon. It's extremely frustrating that we are so slow to get a hypersonic missile program going. The Army claims they're going to get it done this year, General. I heard that last year and the year before, so hopefully this is the year. So we'll see. But that's the problem. We don't move fast enough, and it costs a lot more than we should be paying.
There's clearly some early signals at the department changing their acquisitions strategy in relation to their reliance on the primes. Last week, Anduril announced that they moved on to the second phase of CCA, which is one of the first times over the past sort of 30 years that a top 5 prime was not one of the final contenders of such a sort of large program. How do you take that as the sort of department's sort of shift in sort of strategy, and would you expect them to start to pursue a similar shift in some of these areas like the hypersonic domain and consider no longer relying on purely the top 5 primes?
Well, by the way, it was 2 finalists, General Atomics and Anduril, and neither one are prime, and that'll be in the competition. Also, Sierra Nevada got the contract for the so-called doomsday planes that we have. In case of nuclear annihilation, we have these 2 planes that fly around, and as well as we have our command on that, and they got the contract for that. So those of you who are in this market, I mean, we've come a long way, and we recognize that we need to expand the opportunities beyond the 5 primes. And I'm sure they're here in the audience are probably mad at me, but the fact of life is that we've got to move faster and quicker, and unfortunately, it's taken us too long, and it costs too much for some of these systems. So we're going to have to broaden our horizons here.
Speaking of, in some ways, over-reliance on large companies, I think all of us here on stage are huge fans of, sort of SpaceX. They clearly, continue to move, very quickly. But on the flip side, they currently are effectively, all of the Western world's, capability to bring mass into orbit. Tom, you're obviously heavily biased as a former founder of SpaceX, but does it ever bring you any concern that there still aren't really other players, other people that can, field net similar capabilities? Even your own company, in some ways, of course, you have shares in SpaceX, but in some ways, it would be in your own company's best interest that there were more competitors to SpaceX. How do you think about the sort of evolution of the launch industry and what's in the best interest of both companies like Impulse and the United States for how that industry evolves?
Yeah, certainly SpaceX is so far ahead. It's hard for others to even get a foothold, but there are some more coming online, and some like the next step. Like SpaceX started recovering rockets economically and really proved that works. And their next step is fully reusable using both the first and second stage. So you don't throw away any of the hardware. You just provide propellant and operations and refly it many times. And I know Stoke Space is doing that, and a few others are looking at doing that. In order to compete, I think in the future it'll be all about full reusability. I really hope that these other companies can get there. SpaceX does need competition. I know they've maintained their price even though their cost has gone way down because that's the market, right? With competition, their price can come down quite a bit, and we need to see more competition.
When this kind of brings back a memory back in 2003-05 on that time frame, United Launch Alliance would come in and say, well, we need this cost plus contract because we're not making any money. It's kind of patriotic, we do all this kind of thing. And Mike then was head of NASA. We said, this young guy came in and said, hey, you need a little bit of investment money and get some launches going. So we gave him a couple of government launches. You remember those things, and we wanted to create competition for United Launch Alliance. Well, guess what? The launch cost went down by about half. And now pretty much SpaceX is the monopoly. Now, we didn't intend it to be that way. We hope to have more competitors out there. So those of you, we would like to see more entrance into the space launch business. Maybe Elon doesn't feel as compelled to have a monopoly anymore. I hope. So we'll see.
We clearly have a ton of collaboration in the civil space world, right? The International Space Station is a multinational system. Artemis has many, sort of national supporters. Chairman, I'd be curious how you think about in relation to some of the more national security priorities, whether it's hypersonics, eventually sort of lunar military activity. How would we ideally collaborate with some of our near peer allies, especially let's say with the sort of recent AUKUS policy changes? To collaborate with them on some of these types of technologies. How do you think the department should be leaning on allies in the space domain?
Well, obviously, we want allies in all aspects of our military security. We need those allies. We need Japan, South Korea, Australia, especially in the Indo-PACOM theater. And development of space is expensive. If we can get allies working with us, that'd be great. Japan has a lot of technological advancements, and so does South Korea. So do others, and so India. And so I think there's a lot of future for a lot of these countries who want to work with the United States and be friendly to our interests. And I think everybody can prosper from a great future in space.
I'm curious whether the two of you think, with SpaceX's current monopoly, if that extends for another decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, is there potential for regulators to start to come in and, similar to how Boeing and United previously were a single company and you had the builder of a fuselage and the operator of a fuselage, a single company, do you guys expect there to potentially be, sort of similar regulation in SpaceX?
I'll leave that one to Tom.
Yeah, I think as, companies like Impulse and the new space companies are evolving the technology fast, and I think it's hard for the regulation to keep up. Like, for example, on our Mira spacecraft, which we have flying right now, we from a clean sheet designed, built, and flew that in about 15 months, and it takes that long just to get approval for the spectrum. Or we would love
down from space.
Yeah, you know that very well. Or for example, we would love to. We have lots of propulsion capability. We would love to deorbit that over the ocean, but the amount of bureaucracy just to deorbit it, it's like just leave it up there and let it come in randomly. It's like, well, we could actually hit the ocean with it and make sure it's not a problem. So I think like SpaceX is flying every 2 or 3 days now. I'm sure they have, almost like an airline type operation with the government on their regulation, almost not quite a rubber stamp, but just make sure that they're flying the same thing. We need to get to that point at some point for orbital transfer vehicles. Like, we're changing orbits. We're gonna be over here now. Is our spectrum okay there, where it's just more seamless?
And maybe as my last question is a bit of fun. It's a decade from today. Sort of 2034 in the May time frame. Fort Kennedy on the south pole of the moon is fully established. Do you guys go and visit?
I'll be about 80 years old, so they'll let me up there. I'll go up there with Buzz Aldrin, who wants to go back to the moon.
Tom?
As I've stated on social media, my bucket list item is to ride an electric dirt bike on the moon. So hopefully I can make that happen.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.